So now we're gonna start our fourth workshop, number 4, and I want to call the presenters for today. From Professor Eric Garrett class, can I have Devin, Leo James, and Deli Stephen come sit here, please? And from Professor Percy's Clara Rose. And from Professor Maggie Patterson, Isabella Abbott. And from my class, Nate, Allison, and Veronica. Oh yeah, should be on. So let's start with our first presenter for today, Devin. Let's have the slide on, yeah. So you can start. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Stephen D'Elia.
Hello, my name is Devin Jackson, and I did my presentation on the tribal nations and climate change. The introduction. So, due to the constant change in the climate, it causes hazardous and hardships for the tribal nation people that reside in and around the areas of Alaska. The change in climate directly affects the rural areas of the Arctic and a high percentage of the population in these areas of the tribal nation members. These changes cause temperature changes, which causes the ice to thin and melt. While the ice thins and melts, it causes other issues such as ocean acidification. Issues affects marine and wildlife routines, species distributions, and rising ocean level. So the problem with the climate change in around Alaska, residents not only continue to be affected by the effects of global warming, but accumulation of these issues are on the rise. The warming climate directly affects human health. The rural residents face storm damage, flooding, loss of food sources, and disrupted traditional and generational traditions, and possibly relocation. Global warming threatens the livelihood and the customs of the rural residents of the tribal nations. Consumption of greenhouse gases and global warming has caused the Arctic ice to melt and faster than originally anticipated. So some of the solutions to global warming is limit the consumption of greenhouse gases, switching to older, less reliable products, and switching them to new, more energy-efficient products. Switching to solar or wind energy to power out homes, buildings, and appliances. The people around the world are adapted to the technology that uses fuels. Governments should reform and adapt to safer products that can lessen the effects of climate change. For the sake of the tribal nations that reside in and around the surrounding parts of Alaska, we should show equity to their culture by preserving the indigenous people traditions, customs, and norms. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin, for a great presentation. Let's go with James, and his title is New Jersey Farms Alive.
So just to preface, for Dr. Garrett's class, we had to choose kind of like a culture, and we had to describe how that culture faced climate change head on and how they adapted to it. So I chose New Jersey farmers, and just to provide some background, farming in New Jersey is about as hard as it's ever been. Farms were once a defining feature of New Jersey, but they have all but disappeared from the Garden State in the last few decades, and those that remain, as they always have been, are at the behest of climate change, which has steadily risen temperatures across the globe, and especially in New Jersey. And average temperatures in New Jersey have risen by about 3 degrees in the last century, which might not sound like a lot, but it also means that extreme temperatures and extreme weather events are becoming more common. And that winter months are warmer, so pests will stay around for longer. Pests that are normally dead in the winter will stay around for longer and in greater numbers. And it also means that, the typically colder months won't be cold, so they'll be warm, and certain crops won't be able to grow very well. Another problem they face is inconsistent rainfall patterns. So some rainfall you can predict, but some you can't, and there's some you can't do anything about, and it'll wash away crops. Like I said, even when you can predict it, there's just some things you can't deal with, and that's just the nature of farming. Dry spells are also hard to predict and hard to deal with. I mean, they've also been able to, farmers have tried to irrigate it, but it only goes so far. So just describing farmers a little bit in New Jersey and describing how they've changed in response to climate change. The average age of farmers has risen from 52 to 57 years old in the last 20 years, and that owners of farms don't usually have a younger family member to pass the farm on to. So what does that mean? That means that less people are getting into farming, or less younger people, I should say, are getting into farming, and so family farms that are usually passed through generations are starting to die out. And even though and one big reason for that is even though food prices have gone up, farmers' wages have not, which should not come as a surprise. It's long, hard work. It's mainly thankless work. And yeah, I mean, the farming community is relatively tight-knit, but, they have the largest job loss of any population, and, for the reasons outlined, there's not many new farmers coming in, not many young farmers. So getting into how farmers have adapted to the idea of climate change, so I talked a little bit about extreme weather events, and one of those is heat stress in the spring, which is, kind of like when it's a little bit warmer in the spring, which affected the growth of apples. And in response, New Jersey farmers sprayed the apples with sunscreen, which is not the sunscreen you're thinking of, but it's similar in that, like, it prevents the crops from the sun's harmful UV rays. So it's not exactly sunscreen, but it's similar. And I mentioned droughts. So droughts would leave crops without the necessary water to grow, and then floods would carry them away. So what did they do? They irrigated farms during extended periods of droughts, and they also built infrastructure to prevent rain from washing away crops. Again, it wasn't totally foolproof. Sometimes there's still events you can't deal with, but it was much better than what they had. And in response to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, farmers put the gases back into the soil. And to conclude, although farmers are still scarce today, New Jersey farmers are implementing unique strategies to keep the remaining ones alive for as long as they can. And there's reason to believe that no matter the circumstances thrown at them, farmers will continue to optimize the growing of certain crops. But as temperatures continue to rise and as extreme weather events become more common, farmers will have to come up with new solutions to maintain their farms.
Thank you so much, James. It was a great presentation. Let's go with our third speaker for today, Stephen Daly.
Hello, so my name is Stephen D'Elia. I'm in Dr. Garrett's class, and the way I went about this project was I went to look at view as Sweden as a country as a whole, considering that they've been a pioneer in climate change policy and changing and working. And considering they're one of the top countries, if not top, in responding to climate change, they have implemented a 30-year plan back in 2015 to reduce their carbon emissions down to 0%, which is also known as a very aggressive way to target climate change. And as of right now, 7 years into the plan, they're already at in terms of their production for power, majority of it is already in renewable sources. And one of their main strategies is taking advantage of their geography in the country. And considering that over 60% of the country's geography is taken up by rainforest or being around surrounding waters, their top two forms of green energy production are in hydropower and biomass. Now, considering that they are already over the majority, they're trying to find new ways to integrate green power to increase that number to get closer and closer to 0%. They are currently constructing plans in producing wind farms that are offshore, considering that with a lot of their geography being rainforest, they don't want to implement wind to cut out forest and in turn lower their things. So the country plans to expand offshore wind farms in the surrounding waters to improve their power from offshore wind farms from 20 to 30 terawatts to approximately 120. With Sweden being the top leader in green energy in the past 3 years, if you look to the bottom graph, you can notice that Sweden is above fairly by any other country in the world. And if you look closely at the bottom, the United States is under 10%, but with Sweden being very aggressive in their response, they're doing very well so far in their 30-year plan. With their plan also, one of their main strategies being their key performance indicator, otherwise known as KPI, with being their green energy output, they're doing very well so far. With Sweden being the leader in green energy, while constantly looking to improve, they have almost become almost a blueprint for other countries to implement strategy to improve their green output. For example, considering that their top strategy is go hand in hand with the geography, it almost complements and goes hand in hand with each other. From the figure to the top, or top right, you notice that you can see that they have several strategies in the top right graph, you can tell that with the way that they're doing this with biomass, they're turning houses into potentially renewable outcomes for themselves. So in a way, people living there are self-sustaining for renewable energy as well. So with the European Union consuming less than 20% of United States' energy consumption, you can tell that Sweden is on the right path towards 0% carbon emissions. With over half of the country's energy coming from renewable sources, they've also instilled environmental consciousness into their society as a whole as well.
Thank you so much. So yesterday, Dr. Megan mentioned that we have only until 2030 to to fight the effects of climate change and the rising global temperature across the world. So Sweden is taking the lead, and we saw a great example here. Can you give us examples on how Sweden is tackling climate change through like wind energy or?
What was your question? Can you rephrase that, please?
Can you give us specific examples on how Sweden is fighting climate change?
Yes. Well, with considering that Sweden is located on a part of the peninsula, they're surrounded by a lot of bodies of water. So instead of producing giant wind farms and cutting away rainforest, they decided to do offshore. So they can still produce high levels of energy output through biomass while also producing more power through wind farms. So they plan on doing offshore plants for wind farms rather than on land.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just have one more question. So do you think the New Jersey model can be replicated across other farms in the United States or in the world?
Yeah, I think it totally can, but I wanted to make it clear, like when I was saying the solutions, is that, you know, I think farming in general is like a very skilled profession, but you depend on the environment, you depend on Mother Nature a little bit. It's totally dependent on the weather. So I think it can be replicated, but I still think, you know, as extreme weather events become more common, it's going to become more difficult.
Perfect. Yeah, it's dependent on different factors, weather and climate conditions, definitely. So let's have now 5 minutes for discussions regarding the three presentations, and you can ask questions after that. Thank you. Yes, please.
So thank you three for a great presentation. All three, it was interesting, shows cultures that I think sort of, I don't know if it was just with your presentations came out how connected they were to the environment, that they're all in some sort of way attuned to the environment and using their local landscape for kind of fighting and dealing with climate change. And so I guess the sort of question I'd like to ask the three of you, since you guys got to choose the kind of culture you wanted to research, what drew you to the kind of culture that you ended up kind of making your poster on? So what was it about the culture that drew your interest? Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, for me, I've always kind of had a good look at farms. I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania, very close to New Jersey's, and my parents worked on farms for years, so I've kind of seen them kind of disappear a little bit, and obviously there are other circumstances that have contributed to that, and those were kind of difficult to keep out in my presentation, but I think part of me was curious what else contributed to it, and that's why I picked it.
The reason why I selected Sweden was mostly because I had noticed that immediately when we were talking about climate change, the first country that came to mind was Sweden, mainly because they found a way to integrate not just their government, but also their society and culture into climate change. So there has been almost no disruption in terms of government plans being integrated with the society and no pushback from the people because everyone is involved, from just the normal person all the way up to high-level government officials.
So the reason why I chose the tribal nations and climate resiliency is after doing a little research, I found that honestly, climate change is a global, problem. It's going to affect, all of us. But right now, it's actually affecting Alaska, more because Alaska's, on the top of the the Earth, and they're pretty much the first, the first line, and that gets the effects of climate change. So that's one of the biggest factors why I chose the tribal nations in Alaska.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just one question about Sweden. The option of Sweden, does the option of Sweden impact, for example, the European Union or the neighbors of Sweden, like Denmark, Norway? Are they following the same environmental choices? Does it have impact on the European Union, for example?
So to my understanding, you're asking if other countries involved in the European Union are following Sweden's plans? Yeah, in a way, every country that is involved in the European Union is trying to follow Sweden's plan towards climate change as much as they can. But considering how aggressive their approach is towards climate change and trying to reduce carbon emission as hard as they can, other countries find different roadblocks depending on just their economic infrastructure and overall geography. So other countries do try to follow their plan, but have to adjust according to certain circumstances. I hope that answers your question.
So I just have one question to Devin. I really liked your idea how you try to combine climate change with maintaining and preserving the cultural identity of the people and the nation. So how people of Alaska are doing it and at the same time how they're trying to fight the effects of climate change. Thank you.
Well, climate change, we all, as a community, the whole world has to fight against climate change. One culture or one country can't just do it on their own. It's a global issue. But some of the tribal nation leaders, they have teamed up with Yale University and different universities to help get the effects, or get the awareness out there to other, people in universities. But like I said, it's just one of those things where we all have to get together and be on the same page to make a difference.
Thank you, Devin. So now let's go to Clara Rose's presentation.
Since the 1950s, the world has lost half of its coral reefs. This means that since the 1950s, we have lost half of the world's primary source of oxygen. We've lost half of the world's natural habitat that is home to 25% of all marine life, the primary source of food that 1 billion people rely on globally, and we've lost half of the coastal protection that would otherwise cost $9 billion to maintain. A coral is an animal made up of polyps, which are tiny, soft-bodied organisms that live on a stony, skeleton-like structure. These animals have a symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae, a type of phytoplankton that photosynthesizes and produces 70% of the world's oxygen supply, more than every tree and plant on land. These phytoplankton live in the protection of the tissue of coral reefs, while they supply the corals with glucose, glycerol, and amino acids, which the coral uses to grow. Roughly 90% of the materials produced by zooxanthellae is transferred to the coral. This mutual relationship is the key to both organisms' survival. Without healthy reefs, it is harder for these phytoplankton to produce oxygen. Coral reefs are extremely susceptible to climate change, and if the ocean raises just 1.5 degrees Celsius, this would put 99% of coral reefs at risk. In addition, the ocean absorbs 90% of the heat that is trapped in the Earth's atmosphere. 1.5 degrees may not sound like much, but to such a delicate ecosystem, this could set off a domino effect of ecological collapse. If a species loses its habitat, another species could lose its food source, and so on. Corals take about 1 year to grow only 1 centimeter and can be broken in 1 second. As tourism increases, climate change increases, since transportation is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. There are many threats to corals, but by far the biggest is climate change. No matter where we live, even if we're not close to corals, what threatens coral reefs is a threat to the global environment because of the multitude of the necessary resources that they provide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clara. So yesterday, Dr. Megan mentioned that the rapid loss of species we're seeing today is estimated by the experts to be between 1,000 to 10,000 times higher than the natural extinction rate. And it's increasing as the years go on and we don't take any action. I want to see if any one of you have any questions to Clara regarding her poster, No Ocean, No Air, and how she tied marine life with other animals. Anyone from my class? So let's have 3 minutes for discussion across the tables, and then we'll continue. Thank you. So we have a question actually here from the presenters to Clara Rose.
So, what are some actions people are taking to counter the effects of this?
So one of them, there's a lot of different nonprofit organizations that will take pieces of healthy coral reefs and propagate them so that they can multiply them. And they're trying to look at what different adaptations different corals have taken on in order to kind of prevent the effects of climate change and survive the heat waves. And I think a big one would be education, because a lot of people don't realize the impact that they have. And if tourists go to a tropical area and let's say they're snorkeling and kick a coral reef or touch it, they don't really realize the impact. So I think awareness would be the biggest one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? And so, Clara, what do you think we as students can make to, can take actions to fight climate change as students? What are the greatest things we can do?
I mean, there's a few. I know that the biggest impact one individual can have is eat less meat, especially red meat. And that doesn't have to mean going vegan, but even just reducing it a little bit can make a big impact. There's also the issue of plastic. So I think reducing the amount of disposable plastic, that also is impacting coral reefs. So I didn't touch on that. And just trying to turn off the lights and using public transportation, basic things like that to prevent climate change and greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, these are actually the simple steps that we can take on everyday basis to fight climate change. And I think the plastic issue that you just mentioned is a big thing because I notice like students use a lot of plastic in everyday, and they can just try to use more washable like cups and plates, and it would make a huge impact. We think it's just like one straw or one plate, but in effect, if I think like this and you think like that, the effect is really great. And together we can make a great impact if we change our daily habits. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation, Clara.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's go now with Isabella.
Hello. Isabella actually wasn't able to be with us today to present, but my name is Olivia and this is Nick. And our poster serves as kind of background information for our project in our investigative reporting class with Professor Patterson. And our presentation today is part of this group, like class culmination of research that's going to cover many angles and aspects of homelessness. So in the future, in the couple weeks after this, we are hoping to interview a couple of experts and people who might be personally affected by this. So our focus is on two different angles. First, how climate change creates negative conditions for those who are already homeless. And the second angle, how it is contributing to homelessness and causing it. So for our presentation today, we will focus on the latter. And not in this poster, but according to the US Geological Survey, increasing global surface temperatures have the possibility of creating more droughts and higher intensity of storms. And rising sea levels can create more exposure for higher locations to receive effects from the oceans and erosive waves and currents. And so we tried to take more of a local focus as we tried to look at Pittsburgh specifically and Pennsylvania specifically. Obviously, we're not on the coast, so we're not seeing those rising seawaters as much, but we are feeling the effects via more precipitation, flooding, landslides, etc. And we have chosen to focus on flooding and precipitation in those factors in homelessness.
So as you can see on the first chart we have here, which covers Pittsburgh mainly, but does also have aspects of PA as well as the rest of the world. Since 1970, there's been an 8% increase in annual rainfall across all counties in Pittsburgh. There's also been, then to go to the other side of PA, in northeastern PA, there's been a 70% increase in annual precipitation from heavy storms. And then 14 million is about the average number of people per year made homeless by natural disasters worldwide. That does include natural disasters. On the source we got was rainstorms, flooding. It also included earthquakes, but it was mainly a lot of water-based issues. There are 18,462 properties in Pittsburgh with a greater than 26% chance of being severely flooded over the next 30 years. And then to kind of keep it in the United States, but show other than Pittsburgh, there are about 80,000 homes that were vacant in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And then to bring things back, in Pennsylvania as a whole, the amount of communities considered safe from high water is only 186. Meanwhile, the amount of communities considered not safe is 2,571. And then just on this other graphic we have here is just a look at some of the bigger floods in PA. The first one was in 1889 in Johnstown, which included a rainstorm. Over the course of 24 hours, up to 10 inches of rain fell and overflowed the banks to the point where even the South Fork Dam collapsed, which caused 1,600 homes to be lost in that flood. And then in between the two, in Pittsburgh actually was the St. Patrick's Day flood in 1936, which was considered the worst flood in Pittsburgh history, where the flood levels actually peaked at 46 feet. This led to millions of dollars in property damage and left 135,000 people homeless. And then finally, back in Johnstown in 1977, was another storm which led to 12 inches of rainfall in 10 hours, $300 million in damages, and hundreds of people lost their homes. And it was so severe that it was declared a region, a federal disaster area, and the National Guard was actually sent in to assist in these relief efforts.
And obviously, these are more historic examples, but we are looking at the totality, the time frame in which these disasters were happening and how things are getting worse. And another aspect we are looking at that's not necessarily on this poster is the aspect of flood insurance, as it's a different kind of insurance than homeowners, and people who don't live in high-risk areas for flooding don't necessarily have to purchase it. But there is a statistic from the Federal Emergency Management Agency that states that people outside high-risk areas file more than 20% of National Flood Insurance Program claims. So we are also looking at this aspect that also could be a factor in homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a truly great presentation, and I really liked seeing so many statistics and numbers, because without measuring things we can't manage, and you try to tie climate change with such a vulnerable population, which is the homeless people. What do you think are the next necessary steps that we can take in Pennsylvania to help homeless people?
I mean, I think it's hard for us to say right now. We're actually planning on having a couple of interviews with some agencies in the area that might already have some of these ideas going. I think one of the most important things, though, is to recognize that it is a problem, and that when there is flooding, you know, a lot of people are lucky that we live in homes and we have places to go when the weather gets bad, but there are a lot of people who don't, and just kind of recognizing that, as long as providing some kind of shelter and other aid for those people who are vulnerable.
Thank you. Let's have 5 minutes for discussion, and then I'll open the floor for questions. Thank you. So I just want to ask one question, and then we'll see we can listen to others. What inspired you to undertake this research project?
Actually, it was part of our class. So Professor Patterson assigned 4 different groups, and we're all looking at different aspects of like factors that could contribute to homelessness, and just making the public more aware of this problem and what we can do to help the people who are in need. So our group was assigned climate change as it relates to this, and from there we've just been researching and investigating that situation.
Do you know of any other factors that contribute to homelessness in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes for the country. We've been looking at the formerly incarcerated and how that can affect homelessness. We are looking at generally reasons for homelessness. So one group is kind of looking at multiple angles, including affordable housing, among other factors. And then another group is actually looking at those who are previously veterans.
Thank you. Let's hear from you. Do you have any questions? Where's the microphone? Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. So for this last one, it says the last major flood in Pennsylvania was 1977, so that's 45 years ago. So I guess I kind of have 2 different questions, hopefully you can answer. So I guess my first one would be, what steps have been taken since then, since that was a long time ago? And then when you bring this to people, how do you rile like the community, and how do you get them to really take interest, since it might seem really far away from them?
Yeah, actually, Isabella did most of the research on this section, but I know that in Johnstown, a lot of the infrastructure changed after it, because when you drive into this area, there are like these high flood walls by the river. So there are ways in which people have changed the infrastructure. But as far as like making more people aware, unfortunately, I feel like the situation sometimes is like, unless it happens to you or someone that you know, people aren't as aware of it. And aware of how devastating it can be to people who are living in lower income communities and might not be able to afford, buying a whole new house and relocating. So I think it's a matter of just kind of making this more known, and that's what we're aiming to do because we're going to be publishing our findings and interviews in a website that'll be accessible to people who want to learn more.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I have a question. So we all know that
It's here from the presenters.
So homelessness is pretty much, a big problem around the world. But around for Pittsburgh, is there anywhere that the homeless can go to take refuge from, like a shelter, anything to take refuge from, like a flood or like any bad storms?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some shelters that will open when it's really hot or it's really cold. And I'm assuming, I don't know for sure that they are open during storms, but I would hope so. But they do open for inclement weather. But I think sometimes the problem is just how many people can be in each shelter. They sometimes have to split up families to be able to go to different shelters. So it's a very complex problem. I think sometimes we, looking at the situation outside, think that it's a simple solution, but there are a lot of other factors going on that make it difficult for people to separate.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions? So let's move on with my students, actually, Nate and Allison and Veronica. Thank you. Let's start with Nate first.
Hi, my name is Nate Amalfitano. I'm here with Dr. Signora's Intro to Ethical Reasoning class. And today I'm talking about university students and the role that they play in climate resiliency. So climate change and its effects on the planet have been a prevalent issue over recent decades. However, progress to combat this problem has been slow. Many young people have identified that issues such as these have heavy consequences that will directly affect them later on in their lives. As a result of this, many college students have begun to take action to decrease their individual impact on the climate. College-aged adults are capable of making changes in their lives that will decrease their effect on climate change and other issues hurting the natural world. As universities begin to implement new ways to design curriculum in an ecologically friendly way, they act as an inspiration and motivation for their students to follow suit in similar ways. However, these actions aren't always widely adopted, and in a lot of cases, a lot of student bodies struggle to sort of identify ways in which they can make changes in their lives. For example, a study at a Taiwanese university showed that after a 4-semester course about issues related to the climate, many students still showed lacking signs of understanding and action prevention, or perception rather, for these issues. However, there are ways in which universities can encourage their students to learn and take action, such as being active in communities, joining on-campus organizations that have a focus related to climate resiliency. These smaller organizations are good too because they can allow smaller groups of people trying to make this change in just their university and sort of take that and bring it to larger groups, and then the issue just becomes smaller as it gets connected to a larger organization that has maybe a greater ability to make a larger scale change. Students can also work to decrease their carbon footprint through actions such as walking or using public transportation as opposed to driving, reducing the frequency that they use heat, and also cutting back on the use of disposable goods. Students at Harvard University have set plans to work aside companies to determine ways that make infrastructure and investment good, and how business can be conducted ethically, profitably, as well as through an environmental consciousness. So sort of how the business world is brought into that aspect, how this sort of can be The idea can be implanted while in university, and students can then take those ideas into their professions and apply them into the real world. Reduction of students' carbon footprint is another major way students can reduce their impact on the climate. Study at the University of Talca showed that commutes to campus by faculty and students were another major contributor to the campus's carbon footprint as a whole. While progressive steps forward have been made in how college students handle issues related to the climate, there is still a lot of work to be done to ensure that such practices are widespread across campuses across the country and the world. On-campus organizations give students the chance to act sustainably, teaching and giving examples of ways to preserve our ecosystems and building a sense of social resiliency to climate change. Certain university programs are setting up students for careers with a priority set on the importance of environmental care and awareness. This allows for prevention of further harm being done to the climate, as these students are more informed on climate change's consequences and how their efforts can help to combat it. And while it is easy to solely focus on the carbon footprint of on-campus students, there's still work to be done regarding ways in which commuter students can come back. Actions such as these to help prevent climate change should not be procrastinated, as failure could have detrimental side effects that go beyond the individual down the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Nate. Let's go to Veronica.
Good evening. My name is Veronica Ceballos. Today I will be presenting marine wildlife, and what I want to talk about today is how marine biodiversity is crucial for the future of all our planet. It is also the foundation for ecosystem goods and services that enable human societies to thrive. By appreciating the ocean prominence to the persisting existence of the life and all of our planet, we will ensure the future generations solidarity towards our life and towards the marine wildlife too. Biodiversity provides us with food, water, material, also with services such as climate regulation, pollination, disaster protection, and nutrient cycling. Changing the trajectory of the marine biodiversity loss means addressing solidarity, sustainability, justice, and equity, and the precautionary approach. This would also affect the main threats, which are habitat change, overexploitation, invasive alien species, climate change, and pollution. If we're able to conserve our marine wildlife, we will ensure life to our future generations and an ethical respect for our own world. That's why today I would say we should all take action in all international levels, making an effort to ensure that governments adopt ethical policies that will be designed to mitigate and adapt to climate change. This global level process also combines the world's leaders along with businesses and youth activists, because we are the future, to change our future and our climate change action, and this will create equity and justice for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Let's go to our last presenter, Alison.
Okay. The research topic I chose to look closer into was if your race can determine how affected you are by climate change. I learned environmental racism can cause things such as unequal air and water quality, along with hazardous environments for people around the world. It can also cause a lack of power to have a say in anything political in these areas. Climate change exposed large levels of inequality to two very vulnerable and disempowered communities, Black and Latinx. This caused communities' health problems and numerous consequences that include loss of heat and electricity, financial mayhem, and struggle. My research helped me understand that Hispanic, Latino, and Black Americans are way more concerned about climate change and global warming. I also learned they are far more willing to join a campaign to change global warming and to take action Black people are 41 to 60% more likely to die as a result of fine particle pollution, depending on how high the temperature rises. Fine particle pollution is an air pollutant that creates a hazy look in the air, depending on how many contaminants are released. The effects can be extremely damaging to those that are exposed and should be considered a major health concern. From a moral and ethical standpoint, it is incredibly wrong to have known about this problem, yet minimal work has been done to correct it. It is morally unjust that lower income minority groups are still disproportionately affected by an ongoing issue that has been present for decades, and it is time that we find a solution not only to the pervasive problem that is climate change, but also a permanent fix to ending the disproportionate harm that minority groups face as a result of the climate change epidemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. So regarding Nate's presentation, I don't know if you all know, but Duquesne University over the last decade has generated the bulk of its own electricity with a clean burning natural gas turbine located in the heart of the campus. This cogeneration plant produces approximately 85% of the power used to light, heat, and cool the university's facilities, with overall efficiency greater than 70%. And Duquesne is committed to climate change. This conference is the proof that we're trying to be a sustainable campus and building sustainable and resilient Duquesne community. Also, this power center that we are in right now is built based on the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design LEED Silver certificate, and they're trying to obtain the certification. It's in the assessment process. So I'm gonna now leave 5 minutes for discussion, and then we can ask our last three presenters. Thank you.
Really? I don't. I panic.
No, I think you did really good.
I didn't study.
I was trying to read, but like for some reason I got lines I was like,
I had to make one double space because I was like, I couldn't read off of my post. I was too scared. I read so fast. I was.
I want to go to the gym.
I want to go to the gym.
Like I literally brought my coach because I knew I was gonna be stressed after.
Mm-hmm. What time is it now? I didn't realize we were going to be up here.
I felt like it was like the same thing as yesterday.
But I heard about it. People were the podium, right?
Yeah.
So we have a question here from our presenters to our presenters.
So my question was for Nate. You had mentioned that there were a lot of resources that people who are interested in climate change can use at Duquesne, but how would, this might be a little bit hard to answer, but how would you convince people who don't see the urgency in climate change that they need to pay attention to it more?
I would say, at least from my own perspective, what I see like the main issue with people taking action against climate change is that whenever it's like talked about, all of like the consequences are sort of seen in like a very like far off like future sense, like decades down the line, when like stuff like severe like ice caps melting and then water levels rising, stuff like that. I think a lot of the problem comes from people sort of seeing as like a future issue, and they don't really see how steps that they can take in the present, especially on the individual level, could have any sort of effect on preventing those things from happening. So I think it all sort of just starts with the individual and just like what the small ways that they can sort of help in their day-to-day lives to prevent climate change. And then sort of if one person does it, kind of just builds up and up until you have like a whole large group of people, and then sort of the issue is prevented.
Thank you, Nate. Yeah, education is, of course, important, and especially when you show them like research results and numbers and data regarding the effects of climate change on our global systems. Let's go to the second question.
So this is for the presenter for this one. I forget what her name was for this one. Yeah. So I thought it was very interesting how climate change affects like different races and things like that. Which what was the target the most affected race out of all of the different races that gets affected by this the most?
Well, I'd say like my research told me all about environmental racism. So like anywhere like living near the equator, like any of those races, because like I said, they had like unequal air and water quality in hazardous environments. And I also think no one really knows about that. So awareness for that would be really good because environmental racism is like the main issue of my whole presentation.
Yeah, I do agree. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Yes, Dr. Shufi.
Just got here, but from what I've seen in terms of your presentations for students, what would you like to see the university do more of to be in line with combating climate change?
Any one of you can answer, not only, any of the presenters.
Possibly just like how she was talking about, have just bring in, instead of a water bottle, a plastic, thing, just bring a cup, you know what I mean, a washable cup, that, after you get started with one habit, you can start another habit and it just keeps rolling on down. So, if if people start, bringing a cup, that might influence other people to, take action against that.
I would say sort of like a preservation of just like outdoor green spaces on campus. We obviously have access to them, but it's a city school, so they're limited. So maybe just keeping up with and just making sure that the spaces that we do have are just like well taken care of and that they're able to be enjoyed by students and faculty.
Just to go tie back to my presentation, maybe you could possibly integrate certain energy output strategies with the current geography, and considering that Duquesne is right on the river and considering how much wind we get on campus, possibly implementing something along the lines of hydropower or even just wind farms also, like potentially a giant wind turbine.
I think in general, you have to get people who are not particularly interested in climate change, or maybe who don't see the long-term effects of it, to get interested. I think that urgency needs to be pressed. That's why I had asked that question to Nate. I just think you kind of have to get the people who aren't interested. You have to show them the long-term effects that maybe aren't even so long-term. They're maybe even short-term. Maybe even like the next couple decades. You have to make it urgent to them.
Can I answer? For me, actually, I think that we have to use more solar water heating systems. Back in my country, like every house has it, and during summertime and spring, we don't actually use any energy to heat our water. And I think this is really lacking in the US and on campus and everywhere. So if we can do this, and it's not as expensive as other new technology. Yeah. Percy has a question. Yeah.
Thank you. This question is not necessarily to one person, but anyone can answer. But it's based on the topic of how it disproportionately affects certain race, right? So the question is, for example, considering that the negative impacts of climate change will likely fall disproportionately on the poor or like specific race, yet developing countries must often increase consumption and emissions to achieve greater economic growth. So do you think developing nations should be exempt from actions to control climate change? Why or why not? I know it's a loaded question, but
Thank you. So Percy's question is to any one of you here.
I know that mostly developing countries are the ones that are responsible for climate change in the first place. For example, I could be wrong, but I think that it's US and China that are responsible for 45% of climate change in the first place. And so I think that if they're the ones that are responsible for starting it, more of the responsibility should fall on them. And I think that because so much of the weight of climate change, like the effects of it would fall on those in poorer nations because they rely more directly on the environment for shelter and for food, then as like the effects of climate change increase and as it gets more severe, they won't be able to necessarily defend themselves or take action against climate change as effectively. So I don't necessarily think that any country should be exempt, but I also think that even if they're willing to do so, they won't necessarily have the resources to do so.
And that's the irony. Any other answers? Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Or thank you so much for really wonderful presentations, and special thanks to all my students. I wanted to choose you all, but I had to choose only 3. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Signora, for a lovely co-facilitating of our conference session today. So let me say a few words before we bring this session to a close. I didn't want to say this to you students, giving such wonderful presentations before you gave them, and said I didn't want to scare the living daylights out of you. But we've been broadcasting this to the world, live, through live streaming. We have communities all over the world listening to you, so you're now global presenters. Well done. You've done posters, you've done presentations, and maybe you'll think of also doing some essays. We welcome the essays from our presenters. Over there you see the books from our prior conferences, and we publish undergraduate essays. So just think as a result of this conference on your CV, you may have a poster at a great national conference, you may have a presentation at a peer-reviewed, fantastic conference, and you could very well have an essay in our conference proceedings. So well done all. It really has been absolutely fantastic. A hand of applause again to all the presenters. This conference is celebrating the spirit and mission of the university, and we have the Spiritans in the congregation engaged with us, both planning and watching the presentation. We are delighted that you have been able to, in your classes, work with your professors. So a special word of gratitude also to the professors for encouraging you and leading you forward in order to make you leaders and change makers for our nation on climate. Thank you all. It's been wonderful having this session with you. Bye-bye.
I'm a movie star.